of Ukraine, and introduce you to somebody who will read out a letter from our colleagues in the museum world in Ukraine in a few minutes. So just to talk about the ICOM statement for the moment, as of the 24th of February 2022, the military forces from the Russian Federation obviously invaded Ukraine. The International Council of Museums and obviously the Irish Museums Association and the Museums Association strongly condemns this violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, and ICOM is especially concerned about the risks faced by museum professionals as well as the threats to cultural heritage because of this particular armed conflict. ICOM expects both countries, the states parties of the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict and its first protocol to abide by their international legal obligations to protect heritage. Already this conflict is very distressing, deeply distressing, and likely to result in an unacceptable loss of life. Therefore, ICOM calls for a swift ceasefire, immediate mediation between belligerents and coordinated efforts to ensure the safety of museum personnel and protect cultural heritage. In times of conflict and uncertainty like these, ICOM must also express its deep concern for the implications this will have on the safety and security of ICOM members and cultural heritage throughout Ukraine, such as smuggling of cultural materials coming from the region as well as out. And ICOM reminds all national governments in the region of their international legal obligations to protect movable cultural heritage under the 1970 UNESCO Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export and transfer of ownership of cultural property, and the 1995 UNIDROIT Convention on stolen or illegally exported cultural objects, not to mention the other international cultural conventions for the protection of humanity's common cultural heritage. And just furthermore, ICOM advises all interested parties that there are many online free and accessible tools, and you can also access many of these from the Irish Museums Association website, irishmuseums.org. And these tools can help in crises such as this, including but not limited to ICOM and UNESCO's Museum Security and Disaster Preparedness in Running a Museum Practice Handbook, the ICROM First Aid to Cultural Heritage in Times of Crisis Toolkit, or UNESCO and ICROM's Endangered Heritage Emergency Evacuation of Heritage Collections. And with that, I just want to introduce you to the former Director of the National Museum of Ireland, Raghnall, who will read out a statement and a letter from our colleagues in Ukraine. Thank you.
Good afternoon, delegates and colleagues. I'd like to thank the organisers for giving me this opportunity to read out a statement on behalf of the Director of the National Museum of Ukraine, Dr. Fedir Androshchuck, who is a fellow colleague of mine, a specialist in Viking Age. He's well placed to, of course, both from the point of his own interests and his location, to speak on this subject. His specialist area is in this whole area of the confluence between Christianity, Byzantium, and the late Viking Age. And of course, in the current context, with the Putin's denial of the existence of Ukraine, in which Saint Vladimir, who was the first Christian saint of Russia, was king of the Rus, from which both Russia and Belarus take their names, and also is the king who introduced Christianity to Ukraine, and after whom the cathedral in Kiev is located. So it's particularly appropriate, and if not ironic, that the specialist is located and has a particular interest in this matter. Dr. Androshchuck is a Ukrainian archaeologist who studied in Kiev and spent over 20 years working in museums both in Ukraine and in Sweden, and was appointed director of the National Museum in 2021. At the outbreak of war, I contacted him to ask him how we might help him, and he has asked me to read out this statement, which I will now do so. It's entitled, if I could just share. Can you see that? Can you see the screen? Yes. Yes, thank you. The Dr. Androshchuck's letter reads as follows. As I write, it has been 10 days since Russia invaded Ukraine. I would like to share some experiences and observations I have made about the impact of this event on my work and duty as Director General for the National Museum of the History of Ukraine. First, don't expect any clear instruction or guidance from your chiefs. Things happen much faster than they are able to deliver a decision. On the eve of war, very few regular people, as well as politicians, believe that war would actually happen. Panic is the worst thing at this time. That is why any signals of worry from museum directors would be ignored by the Ministry of Culture. Even if there is an elaborate plan showing how museums should act during military conflicts, there are a lot of principal obstacles that make its implementation unrealistic. The Russian attack on Ukraine was launched at 5 o'clock in the morning. I was awakened by a colleague telling me that Giuliani and Boryspil city airports were being bombed. How many of my museum colleagues were expecting to see this day? Many have families, parents, kids, pets. They're all terrified at the sound of sirens, shells, and the roar of aircraft. Even those who are obliged to be there, administration, the chief keeper, can't be available because of logistic and/or communications problems, or because they are simply afraid. So in such circumstances, the only staff you can rely on is devoted people. We don't find devotion listed in job specifications. It can be revealed only in unexpected emergencies like this. Now it is difficult to believe, but on that grey morning I found at the museum about 20 devoted people, collections keepers, technical workers, carpenters, guides, researchers, librarians and law experts. They all contributed to disassembling exhibitions and packing exhibits. The experience of the Second World War shows that looting and aircraft strikes are typical dangers museums can face. Evacuation can make sense if you have at least a couple of weeks before military operations are activated in your area. The ideal solution is the evacuation of exhibits by air. Evacuation by train has its bad sides. The railway can be demolished. The train can be damaged by bombs or rockets from the air. Facing the eventual occupation of the city, the Ministry of Culture, if it is still active and not on the move, or museum administration, needs to make a decision about the collections and exhibits on display. If you are certain that the army of occupants will respect the international law of protecting heritage, you may skip the dismantling of exhibitions. However, this is not the Ukrainian case. During the time of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, many archaeological, numismatic, and other objects of Ukrainian culture were removed from Russia and found their places in the showcases of such Russian museums as the Hermitage and the State Historical Museum. There is no guarantee that, in line with Putin's denial of Ukrainian statehood and identity, that Ukrainian cultural heritage would not be the subject of mass robbery. So I have made the decision to remove and hide all exhibits. If you have a large collection in very limited time, it is necessary to establish an order of priority. In 1970, in the Soviet Union, instructions concerning the protection of museums and artworks from the means of mass damage was issued. It is still pretty much in use in most post-Soviet countries. According to it, objects should be classified into two categories. The first comprises items of national and world importance, unique relics as well as rare objects, natural history, and the history of science. The second group includes similar categories of objects which have primarily national significance. Both groups have special distinguishing marks that enable easy location in showcases and museum stores. Timely evacuation or placing of exhibits in specially prepared underground stores are recommended for objects of the first group. Items of the second group need to be evacuated after the security of the first group is completed. The selection of both groups needs to be undertaken by competent teams of experts. They compile lists of objects of both groups specifying their number, size, weight, and volume, and finally orientation for the planning of packing materials and transport. Irremovable objects should be listed in a special catalogue and need to be protected on the spot. This is basically the main principle according to which we have undertaken work in our museum. Once all the exhibits have been removed and hidden, the museum turns into huge storage. Its public work is limited to online activity. This means you need to have a good, competent team of writers able to deliver good quality text adapted to the wide public, focusing on museum items. People can't visit the museum, but they are still interested in watching and interpreting the museum's objects. Such conscious destruction of the exhibitions is a preventive measure to keep the museum collection safe from possible looting At the same time, this dramatic moment can be considered as a crucial point for the beginning of a new museum. It is a time for rethinking the narrative of previous exhibitions and considering possible new roles for the museum. In a postscript sent to me at the end of last month, Dr. Androshchuck adds, "Today the situation has changed slightly. There is much help from different institutions and private individuals from around the world. With the help of the Nordic Museum in Stockholm, we have created a special fund to help Ukrainian museums and save cultural heritage. However, the life of Ukrainian museums is still far from normal. Many museums situated on the left bank of the Dnieper River, such as Chernihiv, border areas with Russia, Sumy, Kharkiv, and Mariupol, and are in the zone of the war activities, have significant problems with electricity, heating, and water supply. There are some cases of damage of historical buildings recorded. The status of some collections and museum staff is unknown. In spite of what happens today, I think it is important to think about the post-war future of museums and collect financial help to bring their life back." That's the end of the statement from Dr. Androshchuck, but I'm sure he and his colleagues will appreciate your support in his endeavour to secure and safeguard cultural heritage of Ukraine, and also welcome the support of ICOM and the other organisations. So thank you very much.